Hi, and welcome back to my studio. I'm Russell Smith, and today in this video I'm going to show you the entire painting process, start to finish, of a large aviation painting. Now, in my previous videos I've only featured the underpainting stages of my paintings, but with this one I'm going to show you the entire process, starting with the preliminary layer and then moving to the adjustment layer and then finishing up with the refining glazes. Now, the painting I'm featuring, this one behind me, is entitled Chariots of Odin, and it depicts a flight of German Halberstadt CL.IIs from World War I. Now, the purpose of this painting is not to depict a specific event, but rather to highlight the nice, graceful lines of the CL.II. To me, this is one of the most attractive aircraft of the war, right up there with the Falls D3 and the Albatross D5. Now, the Halberstadt CL.II first began to see service on the front lines in the summer of 1917. It was originally designed as a two-seat fighter escort for reconnaissance aircraft, but by late summer of 1917, IDFLIEG, the German Military Aviation Board, had come to understand the importance of close support aircraft operating in conjunction with infantry units on the ground, and the CL.II was assigned to that task. It proved to be very capable in this new role, and its duties were varied accordingly. Its tandem cockpit allowed for excellent communication between the pilot and the gunner, and its one-piece elevator provided exceptional longitudinal balance. The Halberstadt CL.II was generally regarded as one of the best ground attack aircraft of the war. Now, the unit that I chose to depict is Schloss 26B, a Bavarian unit known for its red flame markings on the noses of their airplanes. It's because of these markings that Schloss 26 is probably one of the most recognizable German two-seater units of the war. Now, I'd actually considered depicting one of the lesser units simply because Schloss 26 tends to get a lot of attention, but the lighting scenario I had chosen for this painting called for a cooler and more muted palette, so in the end I decided I really needed that punch of red up there on the nose of the airplane to keep the palette interesting. So with all that, let's get started. Now, when I'm starting a painting, regardless of whether it's an aviation subject or a Western subject, I almost always try to start with the sky, and that's because the sky sets the tone for the painting. It determines the light, the value range, the color, and the mood. So many things in a painting are determined by the light source, and so laying that in first allows me to key the rest of the painting off of that. Now, in this scene, I've chosen a backlit scenario with massive cumulus clouds in the background. The feeling I'm trying to achieve here could probably best be described as epic. This painting is a little different in that I'm actually putting the sun in the painting. Now, I don't normally do that since the sun, with all of its brightness, is a naturally strong compositional element. But in this composition, I'm going to use it as a counterbalance to the main aircraft. Now, usually the rule of thumb is to save your brightest highlights for your closest subjects, but I'm going to break that rule here because, as you would expect, the brightness of the sun will be the brightest highlight in the painting. So for the sun, I'm laying down a thick glob of pure titanium white. I work with a partially open palette, meaning that I'll pre-mix certain color pools that I know I'll need, but as you can see in the inset, I tend to dip into several different colors as I load up my brush. And that way, instead of getting flat, boring areas of color on the canvas, I'll actually get areas of broken color where the paint isn't fully mixed together. And not only does this allow the viewer's brain to do some of the color mixing, but it also makes the color more interesting by creating a subtle vibrating effect in some areas. And it really gives the painting a better sense of life than simple flat color does. Now, as I'm painting, I try to load up my brush with paint and lay down some good thick layers of paint. Doing so can create some really nice textures and some great brush work. And they say that a painting should be interesting from 30 feet away because of the composition. It should be interesting from 3 feet away because of the color, and it should be interesting from 3 inches away because of the texture. Now, as you can see here, I've finished the sky and I've started working on the ground. But I didn't get too far into the background before I decided to stop there and start working on the main subject. And the reason I did that is I know that my darkest darks and my most intense colors are going to be in the main subject, with the brightest brights being in the sun. So I can use those values to act as bookends, with the rest of the values in the painting falling somewhere in between. Now here in the red of the nose of the airplane, it may look like I'm just laying in flat color, but I'm really not. I'm putting in a basic red base, but I'm coming in and I'm tapping in some other colors too, some violets and some blues and some greens as well, just to make that red interesting. As for brushes, I mainly find myself these days using rounds almost exclusively. I used to use mostly flats and brights, but in the past few years I've found that I can get a wider variety of expressive brush work out of a round brush than I can a flat. Now with a round brush I can drag the paint, I can push it, I can pull it, scrub it, tap it, I can do whatever. I can paint in small detailed spots with the tip and then cover broad swatches by using side strokes. Now once I've got that red nose down, I started working on the backlit vertical stabilizer. Now that backlit lozenge effect isn't something that I can get down on the first try. The secret that I found is that when the lozenge is backlit, you have to compress the values down to a narrow range and then boost the saturation towards the warm end of the spectrum. Now I usually lay down one color at a time and then adjust each color in relation to the others as I go. Now while I'm doing this, I also have to consider what parts are going to be opaque, whether they're covered by opaque paint or whether they have part of the aircraft structure preventing light from coming through. Those parts will play by a completely different set of rules, so painting this overall effect is almost like a dance, with the transparent areas informing how the opaque areas should look and vice versa. So now I'm starting on the fuselage, and this is another tricky area. The fuselages of these airplanes were covered in a stippled pattern that overall resembled a large 5-color lozenge pattern. The different colors of the pattern were very close together in value, so I have to make sure that I indicate the color changes without any noticeable shift in value. And that value has to fall somewhere between the white outline of the cross and the red of the forward fuselage. Now I'm getting up under the wings, and once again I'm challenged with a new set of rules based on the effect that I'm trying to achieve. The wings of these particular Halberstadts were covered in 5-color lozenge on the upper surfaces, but most of my sources say that the undersurfaces were simply clear doped linen, which is a warm off-white. Now I have to figure out how warm sunlight filtered first through 5-color fabric and then through plain linen would look. And then, of course, in addition to that, I have to consider what the opaque areas would look like, where reflected light would cancel out the translucent effect, and to what degree it would do so. So now that I've got everything else worked out, it's time to address the ground below the aircraft. Now, of all the things that I paint, I find that creating a convincing landscape as seen from just a few hundred feet up in the air is deceptively difficult. The key word there is, of course, convincing. Whatever I put down there has to have the correct perspective, it has to have good directional lines, it has to fall into the correct value and color range, and it has to support the story. Now, I have a pretty good idea of what I want to do with this and where the major directional lines should be, but I don't have that background completely fleshed out in my head at this point. These planes are flying towards the front, but their airfield would be back away from the front line, so I'm picturing the landscape changing from serene countryside to a battered war zone as you move from left to right. After letting the painting sit for a couple of weeks, it's time to get back to it and begin phase 2. Before I do though, I want to score in my rigging lines so that I'll have something there to guide me when I actually paint in those lines. I'm simply using a straight edge and a mechanical drawing pencil to do this. Now these lines will be covered up again when I start painting, but they'll still be faint enough to guide me along later. It's time to paint again. Once again, I'm going to start off with the sky and get it finished out. In contrast to the first round of painting, where my focus was mainly on the shapes and values that make up the overall composition, this time I'm keeping that composition, but I'm improving on it by making subtle adjustments to the colors and values, minor adjustments to some of the cloud shapes, and refining my edges. With the first round of painting, I started off with a blank canvas, an image in my head, and a good number of reference photos to guide me along. But this time, I'm letting the painting itself guide me as I make my adjustments. One interesting thing to note as I paint the rays of sun streaming through the clouds is that in some places, sun rays actually appear cooler than the ambient sunlight. A slight touch of blue in those rays helps make them so much more effective. Now once I've refined that sky, I want to shift my focus to the landscape below. The time away from the painting has given me a better opportunity to think about what I want that landscape to look like. Now originally I had in mind a nice lush countryside on the right and a war-torn landscape on the left. I think I'm going to change that idea up slightly though. The foreground will be recognizable as farmland, showing various degrees of neglect. But as the eye moves back towards the horizon on the left, there'll be suggestions of a more battered landscape, culminating with the plumes of smoke in the distance. I also need to desaturate those colors a little bit in the landscape since we're looking more or less towards the sun. In that type of situation, the colors would appear more washed out to the eye, and the values in the foreground would appear more stark, particularly on the left side under the sun. As I progress with the landscape, I'm happier with where it's going now. I've reached a good balance between color and value, and I'm happy with the shapes and the directional lines. It supports the subject as it should, and it doesn't compete with it. I won't bring the landscape quite to a point of completion just yet, though. I'll wait until the aircraft are completed, and then I'll glaze in some subtle nuances near the end. Now let's dive back into the subject. As with my first round of painting, I want to start off with that big red nose. I've already decided prior to this that the entire airplane needs to be slightly darker, including the red areas. I also know that I need to desaturate that red slightly. I want that red to make a statement. It's going to read like an exclamation point in an otherwise washed out palette. Regardless though, I got it a little too hot in the initial stage of painting, so this time around I'm going to dial it back slightly by cooling it off a little bit and darkening it on the shadow side. As I begin to paint the engine, I realize that I've placed the gun slightly too high in the cowling. The engine cowling had a cutout where the Spandau protruded, and that cutout helped to define the recognizable shape of the Halberstadt's nose. I need to drop that line down slightly so that it will read correctly. Here we go again on that tricky underside of the wings. My method of painting this area is a little bit different this time than how I approached it in the first round of painting. Now that I've got a good base coat of paint down, I'm going to glaze in a thin, warm, neutral color to establish the local color of that area. Once that's done, I'm going to come back and work in my reflected colors as well as the subtle color shifts that will define that translucent effect. In contrast to the rest of the painting where I'm laying the paint on thick, I'm keeping the paint in this area thin. That thin paint lends itself better to the subtle nuances of this area. The wheel covers of this Halberstadt were covered in a 5-color lozenge pattern. This area isn't translucent, but instead will read as shadow. Now to complicate matters, I'll need to add a layer of caked-on dirt and mud to these wheels. Finding a good balance where the pattern was recognizable through that heavy dirt took some time. I painted the lozenge, added the dirt, dialed back the dirt, added more dirt again, and so on until I was happy with it. Now I'm going to tackle the rudder, and I'm going to approach it much the same way that I handled the undersides of the wings. Only this time, instead of glazing over it with a dark warm gray, I'm going to use a warm yellowish orange tone to unify the colors. I'll then come back into each individual color block and add a touch of color to bring out the individual hues. Just as a side note, if you're wondering about my maul stick, this was my father's cane that he made for himself and used late in his life. My father was one of my biggest supporters, so when he passed away several years ago, I decided it would be a fitting tribute to him to keep his cane and use it to help me paint. Getting to the fuselage now, as I said before, I want to darken it just a little bit. This is another area that I'm going to treat with a thin neutral glaze first. I'll then come back in and stipple in the individual colors of the color blocks, much as they would have been painted in the factory 100 years ago. Well, finally, let's get to the crew of the Halberstadt painted in. Like the red noses of the airplanes, I've got the crewmen's coats a little too warm and light, so I'm going to darken those and bring down the saturation just a bit. Okay, so I'm in the final stages of this painting now. I'm probably 99% of the way done. I just oiled out the painting. You can see, if I hold the camera up close, you can see the sheen on the painting where it's got a fresh coat of oil on it. The purpose of that is to even out all the colors and values so I can see how everything relates to each other, and also to prepare the painting to receive that last layer of paint. Not a lot more to do to it. The planes are almost done. I just need to glaze some stuff, glaze some darks in, clean up some of the details, and finish out these smaller planes. But if I'm going to be honest, I'm not happy with that landscape still. Despite the time I've spent on it, it's just, it needs some editing. Too many shapes going on down there. It's kind of confusing, and it interferes with the subject. So I'm going to edit that some, possibly rework that landscape. I can do better on that. So that's what's going to be my goal for this last stage. So hopefully this goes quickly, and I'll have the painting done in a couple of days. Well, here we are finally in the home stretch. At this stage, most of my changes are going to be small and subtle. The first thing I want to do is deepen some of my darks in a few key places. And to do that, I'm going to use a mix of ultramarine blue and transparent oxide red, which are both dark, transparent colors. They can be mixed together to make a nice, rich black. And you can also modulate this mixture towards the warm or cool end by adding a little more of one or the other. You can also add a touch of white to make it a nice gray. Overall, they make a nice glaze to deepen the dark areas and to add a little interest of color here and there. Now, as a side note, the Halberstadt CL.IIs oftentimes had grenade racks mounted on the fuselage just below the rear gunner. I'd considered adding some to the main aircraft here, but the photo references that I have for Schloss 26 didn't show their aircraft carrying these racks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't, but in the end I decided just to stick with what I know. Now it's time to get down and address that landscape once and for all. What I've put down previously just isn't working. The pond and the horizontal line of trees below the Halberstadt is blocking the flow of the painting, and the directional lines that I've established just aren't interesting. I've decided to simplify that area below the main aircraft and redirect the river so that it carries your eye through the painting better. The best way to simplify that area is to group my darks and lights into larger masses. While the field patterns may look complicated, they're more or less the same value, and because of that, they'll read as one large shape in your peripheral vision, and they won't be as distracting from the main subject. This is referred to as value linking, and it's a great way to simplify a painting's composition. I'm trying to lay the paint on thick here, sometimes even using my palette knife to do so. That's not only to cover up the previous paint layer, but also so that I can get some nice, good texture in the ground. And once again, I'm using broken color to give that ground some areas of color interest. One area I need to be careful of is where the road crosses the river. A visual intersection like that could potentially draw your attention away from the subject. Fortunately, that spot's exactly where the sun would reflect off the water, so I can use that bright reflection as a way to blur the lines around that spot and make it less distracting. And with these final touches, I'm now satisfied that the painting is finished. This is about 3 weeks worth of painting, and that doesn't include the preliminary sketches, perspective drawings, and any other preparatory work that I put into it. As you can see, a large painting such as this can be quite a journey.